Michael Grossberg, and I've been theater critic for the past 3 decades for the Columbus Dispatch in Columbus, Ohio. And I've been working freelance for the Dispatch for the past year. And I'm speaking with Dave Lefkowitz on Dave's Gone By for UNC Radio.
Welcome back to Dave's Gone By on this very Tony-oriented Saturday show, because the Tony nominations were just announced and been talking about them on the Inside Broadway segment, but we're going to go even deeper into Broadway theater with somebody who's been reviewing theater for a couple of decades now. He has been a critic and columnist for the Columbus Dispatch in Ohio for many years, still is. He's also a member of the American Theater Critics Association, a really interesting, fun guy to talk about theater with. His name is Michael Grossberg, and he's with us on the telephone now. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
I'm good. Now, you're usually a bit more up and voluble and etc., but you can explain to people why you seem a little bit, shall we say, under the weather.
Well, it's a long story, but I just got back from a full, intense week of covering theater in New York, and I try to do that every year, at least once, and typically the last week in April, because there's so many shows that open then, and in Columbus, Ohio, our readers and my editors are most interested in the shows that are going to run the longest time and possibly tour, which tends to mean that even though I have interests beyond that, I have to focus on new works over revivals and musicals over plays. So I was able to see 9 new musicals.
Wow.
In the past week, 9 of the 13 new musicals that opened on Broadway this season. And I was all ready to go back Sunday night when I started getting a strong pain that I'd never had before on my left side, and I didn't know what it was for hours, and I was able to medicate it with ibuprofen and go to see the last matinee of Come From Away, which was very good. But it turned out, once I got home and got to the emergency room, as soon as the plane landed, that I had, for the first time in my life, a kidney stone. So I'm under medication now, but not too much pain, and it was a relatively small one, and so hopefully as time goes on that will fade and the memories of the great shows I saw will be worse.
Yeah, and what's nice is you don't think at this point that you've passed the stone. They told you that you would probably know it, but it may still be in there, or may have been broken up.
I've never had this happen before. Yeah. I've had a good friend who had really big ones, and it was excruciating pain. Now, this was a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10.
Ooh. But you should still be having pain.
And it was relatively small and was already almost all the way out. So
knock wood. Yeah.
Normally, they said you would absolutely know it. So I'm surprised that there's been, even with just taking a small amount of pain medicine, there's just been like 1 out of 10 pain for the past day and a half. So I don't know. Crossing my fingers.
Yeah, and if the listeners happen to hear you shriek in agony, they'll now know what that is referring to. And it could
be that, or it could be my reaction to a really bad play. I don't know which.
Well, hey, when you saw the 9 shows in New York last week, all these Broadway shows, did anyone make you want to go, in agony?
No, but they were all so different, and some were very innovative, and some were very old-fashioned. But, the thing that impressed me about the season, especially the year after Hamilton was dominating, is that there really is no one show dominating, and that there's a show for every taste, and there are many innovative works in so many ways. And all 4 of the musicals that got nominated for Best Musical certainly deserved it.
And did you see all 4?
Oh, yes.
So tell us.
The brilliant staging and the mad passion of Anastasia in The Great Comet of 1812. That environmental immersive staging is very powerful. I was sitting right up there on the platform. People were performing like 2 feet away from me. Very intense. Dear Evan Hansen, very powerful, very contemporary family drama, a cautionary fable about teen suicide and about self-deception and people-pleasing. And Come From Away, of course, very inspirational ensemble piece. And Groundhog Day, which I find the most problematic of the 4. I love the film. I've seen the film many times, but I think it had tone and transition problems in the first act. It gets better in the second act, but it's very daring and quirky. The staging was brilliant, and of course, the lead actor
Yeah, he had an accident.
problems. He was performing the night I saw it a week ago, Tuesday night, and you couldn't tell that he had hurt himself. But the amazing thing is, I also saw War Paint, which was fascinating. I didn't know anything about the history of those two great queens of cosmetics, and of course to see Patti LuPone again and Christine Ebersole again, who I've seen many of their great performances. I'm so glad they both were nominated for the Tony for Best Actress in a Musical, although it's pretty obvious that Bette Midler is going to probably win that one. But that musical was just staged so powerfully and impeccably. It has its own structural problems because it's really like two side-by-side stories that are not fully linked until the final scene when they finally come up with a fictional encounter that the two women had. But it's just amazing to think that they had a store a block away from each other on Fifth Avenue throughout their lives and careers, and they never met.
By the way, you're talking about
parallels in their lives. So it's interesting when you see a musical that tells you something that you didn't know before, but it is mainly a star vehicle. So it does make sense to me that if they only had 4 slots this year for Best Musical, that this musical, as primarily working as a star vehicle, would be recognized in a different way through the acting categories.
So you don't feel it was kind of... The 4 musicals that are there for the Tony Best Musical, you think it's fair that all 4 are there? There's no other show that kind of should have been up there, like Bronx Tale or Anastasia?
Bronx Tale was one of the few that I didn't have a chance to see, but I have to say I was surprised at how well Anastasia works. There are 2 shows. Anastasia got 2 small nominations. I am a huge... One of my favorite musicals is Ragtime. And I'm also, beyond Ahrens and Flaherty's music, which Seussical's also underrated. Great composer lyricist team. But Terrence McNally, who wrote the book. He's one of the greatest playwrights and also one of the greatest book writers for a musical. He also did Kiss of the Spider Woman and The Full Monty. And in each case, when he does a book, he actually improves on the original material. So they really did well with it. The staging's very slick. The central actress is wonderful. This is a show that's probably going to run for at least a year or 2. It's going to be very successful on tour. And I wish that they have these arcane rules for the Tonys where if there's like a certain close vote for 4th or 5th place, then they can add a 5th musical. I wish that they would just automatically, in years where they had like more than 10 new musicals, add a 5th slot automatically, because I think there should have been a 5th slot this year. And then it's hard to see whether the Tony nominators would have picked War Paint or Anastasia, but I would have picked Anastasia because it's going to run a long time and it's going to tour, whereas it's hard to imagine War Paint continuing outside of these 2 terrific actresses.
Yeah, I could see LuPone and Ebersole maybe going to London for 2 months and doing it there, as opposed to doing a real national tour, city to city to city. That just wouldn't happen. So I hear what you're saying there.
And there's even other musicals that could become hits without any Tony recognition at all. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was completely excluded from any Tony nominations, although, Christian Borle, who's won 2 Tonys, also received another nomination for Best Actor in a Musical for Falsettos, the revival earlier in the season. But, I've never loved Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I admire Dahl a lot. I like some of his other works better. Not one version of that story have I ever liked. I always think the central character, Willy Wonka, is creepy.
Well, yeah.
But I thought there were some daring and interesting things they did with the show, but it has huge tonal problems, and it's hard to know, is this for adults, is this for kids? But I still like the imagination. Of course, I like the Oompa Loompas and all that, and it's like listening to the audience reaction the night I saw it. I think this is going to be a hit too. This is going to tour. This is going to run for a year or 2 as well. And it's a pretty unusual Tony season where you not only have so many new musicals, but to have so many of them work in so many ways and be popular, whether they get those few award slots or not, that's pretty rare. So it's really an amazing season. If you look at out of the 13 musicals, the only 3 that have closed so far, although I imagine Amelie is going to close in the next month, one was a limited holiday run of Holiday Holiday Inn.
Uh-huh.
One was In Transit, which opened in early December, and
even that ran 4 months.
That was
yeah.
a 4-month run is not like it's 1 month flop. I've seen some shows that closed a month later, but that was probably the weakest musical of the season, and it ran 4 months. And of course, The Bronx Tale was completely excluded, and it's a hit.
Oh yeah.
I think it's wonderful when you have a lot of different types of shows that appeal to a lot of different types of audiences and prove themselves as popular hits, even despite the awards or the critics, even though I'm a critic myself.
Well, let me ask you, which one of the musicals, and it doesn't have to be one of the 4 that was Tony nominated for Best Musical, but which one appealed to you the most? If you had to pull the lever as a Tony voter overall, even though the musicals were so different, is there one that spoke to you the most? Was it Dear Evan Hansen? Was it Anastasia? Was it... Tell me, what was it?
Well, before answering that question, I have to say that after doing this, the first Broadway musical I ever saw was when I was a kid, and it was the original production of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And it was so much fun later in my career when Robert Morris was touring in True, his Tony-winning one-man show, that I was able to tell him the story of how I saw that show around 1963, 64. And so I've been seeing a lot of Broadway musicals, and I've fallen in love with a lot of them. But in recent years, in the last 10, 20 years, it's hard. I no longer expect, I still hope that each year when I go to New York, I will absolutely fall in love with the musical. But it doesn't happen every year. And some of the ones that I fell in love with, Spring Awakening, Ragtime, Crazy for You, Sunset Boulevard, Les Miserables, Sweeney Todd. My favorite one growing up was West Side Story. There's nothing like that this season. And so I wished I could have just absolutely unreservedly fallen in love with something, but I really am emotionally based, and I just honestly wasn't. However, I enjoyed the shows. The sentimental feel-good favorite is Come From Away, and it actually might win the Tony just because it's the right show at the right time, politically, socially. I was having tears in my eyes, not only because I was writhing in pain from my side, but also because it was awakening a lot of memories of where I was on that day and what happened for 9/11. But it's a little too sentimental a show. I hope it does not win for Best Musical. The one that I would have to vote for would be Dear Evan Hansen, because I think it worked the best overall. It's just a modern cautionary fable, very contemporary, but also a timeless family drama, and it's such a cautionary fable about teen suicide and about the whole problems of adolescence and about how people don't realize when they lie, how it can lead to bigger lies and just damage so many people. And I think it was a very powerful show. One thing is clear, that young guy, Ben Platt.
Oh, yeah, they're saying it's going to be...
I have never seen a performance that I can remember like that, because I was sitting up pretty close. I've seen great performances where when I'm watching them, I think, oh, this is a Tony Award winner of the year. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. I remember early 90s thinking that about Stockard Channing in the original 6 Degrees of Separation. And then Mercedes Rule came along in Lost in Yonkers, so it's like, oh, I'm feeling this way about 2 of them, only one can win. But I have to say, this young guy, I don't know how young he is, but there was such passion and real tears and real, every single moment that was like it was like a real person on stage who was a teenager who was suffering from anxiety disorder with these nervous tics and speaking too much and feeling everything so passionately. It's like this was head and shoulders above any other male leading performance I saw, not only this season, but for many.
Wow, because I've got to say, when I was in New York last week, and we met up with each other, it was great to see you, I had not seen, I haven't had a chance to see Dear Evan Hansen, but I did see Groundhog Day, and watching Andy Karl in that show, I was just blown away. I'm thinking this is just triple threat. Dances, even with a bad knee, sings, hilariously funny, great movement. I just thought, he's the guy to beat. But you're saying, oh, Ben Platt blew him out of the water with your Evan Hansen?
He's a great talent, and this is like one of those strenuous performances like when Leonardo Oscar to him. I think Leonardo DiCaprio should have won it for The Departed or for Titanic, and this was overdue. In the case of Andy Karl, I think his day is in the future. I cannot imagine him winning this year. I mean, yeah, if he was like terminal illness and he didn't just fall on his ankle, then he could maybe get a sympathy vote. But even then, that wouldn't be objective. I mean, yeah, he does a terrific job, and it's a very strenuous role, but part of the problem I have with that musical is his character is such an asshole in the first act, and that first act is too expository. You don't really have the dramatic progression until you have from the beginning to the end of the second act, and then the show becomes more satisfying. And it's not an issue of Bill Murray. I mean, Bill Murray is like the sad clown Zen master of the modern era. I don't understand why he hasn't won an Oscar. But the smart thing about the creators of that musical is they were not trying to do Bill Murray. They created a different character who's more of a jock, more of an asshole, like some of those comedians.
Well, he's more like Bill Murray in Scrooge.
Anchorman TV show before they changed. But it's still, you still have a problem connecting to his character all through the first act.
Okay, I mean, to me that didn't bother me so much in Groundhog Day. There are other parts of Groundhog Day that bugged me. Too long, and there, as you said, there are tonal problems, and there's, to me, sometimes just too much of a muchness going on. It's just,
I mean, there's a lot of elements in how you react to a show. At first glance, listening to the score, I did not fall in love with any of the songs. I thought they were very smart. The whole thing was smart, intelligent, has a quirky sense of humor. And it's jagged, and that's courageous. But, this is a lesser work than Matilda the musical.
Oh, see, I was not a big fan of Matilda, I've got to say. Maybe because I saw it very late in the run and from the back row of the orchestra, and just sitting that far away.
As much as the New York Times critic did. He really loved that show. But it was very good. It was haunting. It did key on things. I think it's a better work than Groundhog Day.
Maybe.
And I think I think people who saw both are going to realize that, and Groundhog Day is going to suffer because of that. I think it is the also ran it this year. I think that was the fourth show that was nominated. It was very clear that the other three were going to be nominated and deserved it. For that fourth slot, Groundhog Day was competing against Anastasia, and because Anastasia is more old-fashioned and all the critics are sick of Disney princess shows, although, Anastasia looks like it's going to be the first non-Disney princess musical that's a princess musical by a rival film studio to actually work and be a hit, because all those rival studios have been trying to have something from their catalog that works, and the fact that it's a princess who's not a princess, and the fact that she doesn't get her prince, she decides to choose the non-prince, it has some nice emotionally meaningful reversals in the formula that make it a little bit fresh.
Oh, well,
it's definitely the kind of show that New York will underestimate, but that will be very popular on the road. And there's a tendency in New York criticism to just look at what's the latest thing, what's the most advanced style. If you had a first-rate show in a style from 10 years ago, it would be ignored. Even if it was a first-rate show, because it's not in the current style. So,
well, that's an interesting...
why Groundhog Day, which is more jagged and more daring, got the fourth slot over Anastasia, but it doesn't mean it's going to run as long. Anastasia could run for 2 years or more.
So do you think that's a reason, and I don't know if you saw this in New York, did you see Bandstand? Because that kind of got stood up.
I did, and I wanted to enjoy it more than I did. I loved the concept of it, and I particularly loved the dancing. I'm glad that Andy's choreography got nominated for that. I thought that the central male character did a really good job, but I thought that the whole show was underwritten, and I thought it was rather schematic in trying to show all these men from World War II are haunted by their buddies. There were some nice, beautiful, poetic moments where in the choreography where you see them literally shadowed in movement by the ghosts of their comrades. And for an original score, I thought it was daring and positive that these creators of this musical weren't just trying to recycle the jukebox hits of swing music. I liked their music. I didn't fall in love with it, but I liked it a lot. I thought, if I got the cast album and listened to it a few times, some of those songs I think I might really like.
Hey, can I ask you, Michael, because that always gets me too, because I'm on both sides of this, where you go see a musical and you've got sometimes 15 to 25 songs coming at you, one after the other, and then all us critics come out of the theater going, well, I mean, some of the music sounded good and some of the lyrics were clever, but there's nothing you could remember, nothing you can hum, and then, maybe if you get the cast album and really start listening to it, suddenly, or no, not suddenly, opposite of suddenly, you start to really appreciate what's there. Has that happened to you with musicals you've seen recently in the past few years? Like what?
Well, there are certain shows that absolutely knock me out with the music the first time I hear them. There are two incredible songs in Sunset Boulevard. There's like 8 or 10 or 12 fantastic songs in Ragtime. There are at least two, La Vie Bohème, and I forget the other one, in Rent, where the very first time I saw those shows, I absolutely fell in love with the show. Spring Awakening was like that. I had not heard the cast album. Les Miserables was like that. Sweeney Todd is like that.
Ah, yeah. Well,
very first time I heard them, I immediately fell in love with several songs. But there are other shows. Well, even the same show, Rent, at the Nederlander Theater. I was there the first 3 months, mid-'90s, and it had a rather rock and roll blaring orchestration in that relatively new renovated theater, and I had a hard time hearing the words, which was frustrating. Only when I loved La Vie Bohème, the way that built up to the end of the first act. I loved that first act finale. So I got that, but some of the other songs seemed like noise, and I couldn't connect with them until I then started listening to the cast album. And then so many of the other songs came alive for me. And that is a far more common experience, which is why I advise everyone who reads me and listens to me, if there's a cast album out, spend the $15, $20, get the cast album, listen to it a couple of times before you see the show. You will appreciate the musical as a whole so much more. And actually the most recent variation of that is Hamilton. Now, when I saw Hamilton, I had already bought the 2-record CD and was just starting to listen to it, but it's very complex and very big, and I hadn't had a chance to get into it. So that night when I saw it, I immediately fell in love with certain songs. The 3 songs that King George does were very easy and fun and accessible, and there were others that were haunting, like The Eye of the Hurricane, and In the Room Where It Happens. But it took me a whole month of listening to it over and over, which I found it wasn't a duty. I was falling in love with the show, but I fell in love with the show mostly after seeing it and after listening to the music, and it kept changing which songs opened up to me as I listened to it over and over. Finally, after about a month, I came to appreciate all of it, and the part that to me is the absolute best part of it is the whole sequence of In the Room Where It Happens. But that took a long time. And by the way, that's not a perfect musical. It's flawed. The politics of it, contrary to history, he demonizes Thomas Jefferson and some of the other people. He puts words in their mouth that not only did they never say, they never thought or wrote or said anything like that, and it undermines his work. However, it's still a work of genius. It still deserves the Pulitzer. It still deserves to run for 10 years, just because as a work of musical theater, it is so powerful and so exciting. But what I tell all the people in Columbus who can't get tickets to see it, don't worry about that. It's going to get here eventually. It's coming here in another year or so. Go ahead and get the cast album. You will appreciate 60 to 70% of the musical just from listening to the cast album, which is not true for most cast albums and most shows. Most shows, I would say, if you listen to the cast album, you start to get, you might get 20, 30, or 40% of the show. But with Hamilton, I think it's not an accident that started as a mixtape. I think most of it comes through the music. I mean, the fact that it's a unitary set, they're wearing the same costumes overall, and you do have that wonderful, Andy's wonderful choreography does add a whole lot, but once you get the gist of what it looks like, the story is mainly told through the lyrics and the melodies.
By the way, we are talking with Michael Grossberg. He is the longtime theater critic for the Columbus Dispatch in Ohio, which you just mentioned. So that leads us to an easy segue of what have you been seeing this season in your neck of the woods? What's been interesting? What's been great?
Well, in Columbus, we have 3 professional theaters, Catco, the Short North Stage, and Shadowbox Live. and we have about 24 semi-professional troupes, by which I mean companies that pay their actors but don't pay them at the same high full-time living rates of Actors Equity. So there's a lot going on. Like most regional theater cities, we don't have as many new works as happen in New York, but we've had some really amazing productions this season. Some of them were new works, but the most successful in the past several months was probably Short North Stage's area premiere of the dark Broadway comedy Hand to God, which was extended repeatedly, kept selling out. It was a terrific production, which was surprising in one sense, because I think when that play started off-Broadway and then went to off-Broadway and then went to Broadway, everybody thought, well, this is a great play, but it's sort of like a stunt play, and it's going to be so hard to find an actor who can play that role. Stephen Boyer, by the way, is a Columbus native, and we're very proud of him receiving a Tony nomination for Best Actor in a Play a couple of seasons ago for that. But they got another local actor to do this who did a terrific job. And
well, I had a feel that many years ago when Avenue Q happened, you saw it for the first time, you had to wonder, oh, this is hilarious, this is a wonderful musical. It actually won the Tony, I think. But how are they you're going to have to find puppeteers who sing, and are they going to be able to do it? And of course, Avenue Q has been done a zillion places, and you do find people who can control puppets.
Sometimes certain kinds of darker or more daring shows that take a while to get to Columbus. We only had this season the very belated area premiere of the great underestimated Kander and Ebb musical, Kiss of the Spider Woman, a hugely successful production for Short North Stage in November. They did a very good job with it. It was passionate. It was a phantasmagoric production, and it was very good. They've also done an original holiday musical, Christmas in Columbus, a holiday adventure, in last December that was a hit, and they're bringing it back next December. And going on right now with CATCO, who's the leading equity theater in Central Ohio and the oldest of the professional theaters. They have done new work steadily over their 25, 30 years. And this is the third world premiere by Ohio playwright Herb Brown, and the play that opened just about a week or two ago is Henry Ford's Model E, which is a historical drama, a father-son drama, about the intense conflicts between Henry and Edsel Ford. And it's an interesting chapter in history. I don't think the play works well enough dramatically, to reach New York. But it's exciting when you see it done so well with great staging, great acting, great directing, and it's a work that you haven't seen before. So that was very good. Now, Shadowbox Live, which is unusual, it's sort of halfway between Second City and a regional troupe that emphasizes musicals and comedy sketches. They don't do improv so much as evening shows that combine original sketch comedy that they've then frozen by the time the show opens, along with a lot of rock and roll. But they also do original musicals and dance theater pieces. They did one this past season that updated The Great Gatsby as a dance theater piece with a different title. And currently, one of their biggest hits is called Evolutionaries, the stories and music of David Bowie and Prince. It opened in January. It's been doing really well. It's going to continue into June. And it's a tribute show and a musical review that has a lot of narration and weaves in, because they have 2 screens on stage, so they can do video, images. They have documentary excerpts from the interviews of these 2 great musicians woven in with them doing the songs about them in narration. And they've done several other shows in tribute to other musicians, like the Beatles, but this is by far their greatest. And so we've got some new works here that are doing very well.
Well, having been a critic in Columbus, Ohio for, what would you say, about 30 years so now at this point? Mm-hmm. Would you say like the past 10 years have been better, more exciting, or retrenching a little bit less exciting, about the same? What's the trajectory of Columbus as a theater town?
It's like going through the stages of a life. Each one has its own positive aspects and its own constraints and limitations. But Columbus theater has been maturing pretty steadily, going through stages. We're now in a period of much greater stability than in the 80s or 90s, and we used to struggle in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There was a struggle to get one professional theater going and to keep it stabilized. There were groups that lasted for 10 years or 15 years, and then they struggled and collapsed. So we've continued to have that pattern into the 1980s, but we now have 3 different professional theaters. They're not like operating on the scale of the nearby Cincinnati Playhouse in the Park or the Cleveland Playhouse, which I've also visited and reviewed over the years. They have smaller subscription bases, and sometimes they just have like 2 theater spaces, and one of them owns, well, 2 of them have their own space that they designed, and one of them is renting from one of the downtown performing arts centers, but they all have their own niche. They've all specialized in certain types of shows. If you had a list of 10 shows, you could figure out which theater was the one that to do 6 or 7 of them, and the ones that would overlap would be both Shadowbox and Short North Stage. Both sometimes do the same type of musicals. Both did cabaret. Both might do Spamalot, but they also do other kinds of things that the others would never do. CATCO has tended to stay away from musicals. The last big musical they did was a small musical. They do small, quirky musicals. You remember that jukebox musical that flopped on Broadway for Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it was redone after it flopped and scaled down into basically a musical review. So they did that at the end of last season, and that was popular enough because, people love Johnny Cash's music. But each of the groups has formed their own audience, and they have their own aesthetic style, and I think that means that it gives a lot of Central Ohio theatergoers a lot of choices, and they all do quality works.
Now, Michael Grossberg, how did you become a theater critic in the first place?
Well, I always knew when I was growing up that I loved the arts and I loved to write, so I wrote my first review for my high school newspaper. I'm a Houston native, and of course I went to the Alley Theater to see shows in the 1960s and 70s, and the first review I ever wrote was of a film, Costa Gavras' film Z.
Oh, wow.
Which I happened to see again for the first time last year in like 30 years, and it's a dark, satirical political drama about the different corruption and changes in the Greek government in the 1960s. And I wrote that. I was very proud of myself. It was 1968 for the Three Penny Press, which was a daily mimeographed legal-sized sheet printed Monday through Friday at Bel Air High School, which was at the time one of the best high schools in the country. Our principal, Mr. Andrews, we knew that he was the brother of some famous old Hollywood actor that we didn't know. Years later, I figured out his brother was Dana Andrews. And they had this Mr. Pickett, who was the drama coach. His daughter was Cindy Pickett, who became an actress in the 70s. But in my class were several kids who were cast in the movie The Last Picture Show.
Ooh.
And walking in the halls ahead of me was Randy Quaid, and a year behind was Dennis Quaid. 10 years later, Brent Spiner graduated from there, and there's a lot of other actors I could mention.
Well, that's a pretty great crew right there.
And arts, and I was able to just start reviewing in high school. And somehow, growing up, when I went to the University of Texas, I kept writing various things for the Daily Texan, and all during this time, I kept like, how am I going to support myself? So I was working in other areas, but gradually, just because I loved doing it, and I kept doing it, I kept getting better at it, and I kept finding places to do it, and after a while, people started paying me, so who am I to say no?
Exactly. What was your first review done for the Columbus Dispatch? Do you remember?
Oh, it might have been a revival of Present Laughter.
No kidding. They're reviving that on Broadway right now with
and I wasn't able
Kevin
to see
Kline.
it. I'm a big fan of Kevin Kline. This was the then leading theater was Players Theater Columbus. It lasted from around, 1915 into the early 1990s, and they had a good team of veterans, some of whom are still around, who still perform now typically for CATCO
speaking of growing and retrenching, both of us are members of the American Theater Critics Association, which has, over the past 20 years, owing to the interwebs, seen tumultuous changes in the newspaper world. And you underwent that just a couple of years ago and landed on your feet, which isn't always the case. But, what was it like going through, this cataclysmic change and retrenchment in the newspaper biz?
Well, it's never easy when you go through change. So the whole world's been going through change, especially since 2001. And it's always scary and difficult. I'm glad that I had almost exactly 30 years as a full-time critic and could basically have my career during what you now could look back on as the golden age of newspapers and newspaper criticism, because newspapers are under siege. And it's not because of the decline in news or entertainment. It's because of increasing competition and more stuff. Think back to a half century before all this, and there used to be many more newspapers in the United States, and there were a lot of afternoon papers and morning papers, and people thought, there's less competition, there'll be less voice for people to cover the news when they're only down to one newspaper in each city. But the reason they declined was because of the rise of television and other forms of more accessible, quicker and cheaper entertainment. And of course the internet and social media, even if they're imperfect and flawed and immature, have lowered the cost of information and made it very hard for newspapers to turn a profit. So there have been cutbacks. The Dispatch, we had our first one around 2007, 2008, and that one spared me, but we all had to work harder after that. At that time, that was the first layoff we had at the Dispatch during my decades there, and they said at the time, we don't want to do this repeatedly like some newspapers. We want to be responsible. We had a great private family, the Wolves, that owned us, and they did a very responsible job in the standards
keeping
of
it
the
together
newspaper for as long as they owned it. They had to lay off 1/4 of the staff then, and it was half the staff in the features and in arts department. So I was one of the survivors, and then I started writing season stories for the ballet and the symphony as well. Not just on the theater and comedy beat. But then they finally sold the newspaper to a chain, and they had an opportunity for buyouts, and they offered it to the more senior writers who'd been there a long time. And at first I thought, gosh, I don't want to stop working full time. I was in my early 60s. It's like I want to keep working at least till 65 or 66. But when my editors made clear, they said, if you take this buyout, you'd be in an enviable position because we want you to continue being the Dispatch theater critic on a freelance basis. We want you to continue reviewing the shows and picking what should be reviewed. With myself and my backup critic is Margaret Kwame, who's a very good writer. And they also wanted me to continue doing the weekly weekender theater or comedy column for features about stuff and occasional cover features. So basically I said yes, and that allows me to not work so overwhelmingly hard and do it from home mostly.
But the funny part is that we were talking about this when we met in New York, that, obviously, as we all are, as writers, we're very grateful to still have the voice that we have and to be able to write reviews for a major daily, etc. The other side, and that you're grateful that they gave you all this opportunity. Of course, looked at from their angle, you're doing 70% of the work that you were doing when you were full-time and getting paid a quarter of the salary you were getting with no benefits.
Not as bad as that. I'm doing less than half of the work I was doing, because I think all my friends refer to me as a recovering workaholic. But I was, easily every week working far more than 40 hours, sometimes 50 hours a week. And now maybe I do 25. So I'm really...
So you are half-time, so it's not so bad.
Or I'm able to only concentrate on what I love the most, which is theater, comedy, and the arts. A lot of the other stuff where you'd suddenly be pulled away from an editor, can you do this obit, or can you do this news story, and nobody else is around. I don't have to do that anymore. So it's like, I love what I do. That's the great blessing. I love the arts. I love writing. 90% of the time. The creative process of writing stuff, sometimes on a deadline, when I have to write inside 2 hours a review of a local production to get it on the web, that can be nerve-wracking. But I've done it for 30 years, so I'm a little used to it. It's just that you have to realize that it's never perfect. Once I have sent it off and they're editing it for the web, then I can adapt it and shorten it and tighten it up for the print version. And that's when I normally see, oh, here's how I could have said that better. And sometimes, if I don't worry about bugging the copy editors there too much, I say, hey, can you make these 2 minor changes in the story if you haven't posted it yet? But then I can improve it for print. And
or vice versa. I mean, you've also got this option of if you see a boo-boo in print or you want to expand something or it's unclear, it's actually the internet version that's going to last a whole lot longer, so they can make the change there like a week later and do a correction or add a paragraph or a line about something. Right. It's all flipped, you know?
Well, I try really hard to, everybody is fallible, but we try really hard. There's 4 or 5 levels of writers and editors in every newspaper trying really hard to validate everything. There's that old journalism school saying, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. We try really
Never
hard
heard that.
So I've been pretty fortunate with a lot of due diligence and striving to double and triple check everything. I tend to average no more than 1 correction error per year.
Knock wood. You know, I guess it's just corrections and errors. Sometimes you're like, oh, I really wanted to talk about this and I left it out, or wanted to mention so-and-so, or you read a line and it's okay, but not really clearly saying what you're saying.
Actually, I was having a joke with the resident lighting designer at Catco, Kia Alkier, the night that something was opening, and she came up to me and said, "Oh, they left out my name from the program." I'm sorry, it wasn't lighting, sound design. She's doing the sound design, and we joked. I said, "Well, you know, from seeing my reviews, that in the online reviews, you have a limited amount of time, an hour or two, but you have an unlimited amount of space. It doesn't have to be 14 inches or 12 inches. It could be column inches of 15 or 18, and you can mention more people. But then you turn around and you have more time after that deadline, if you want to stay up until the middle of the night, to write the much tighter, smaller print version. But you've got more time for that, but you've got less space." And the joke was, the first thing that you drop mention of is the sound design.
Yeah, it's the designers. I mean, when I was learning, or not learning, but I was learning to be a more polished critic when I went to the Eugene O'Neill Center and to the National Critics Institute. And they tried to wean us away from this idea of a ghetto paragraph of just the design. So you talk about the show, you talk about the story, the plot, how great or bad the actors are, etc., and what the show is trying to say, and then penultimate paragraph, you squeeze in some kind of adjective about the lighting, the sound, and the costumes, and these days, I guess, projections. And they're trying to pull us away from that and push sort of the design elements all throughout the review. You can't always do that, but I get this thing of like, well, if there's no time, I guess that's the first thing that goes is talking about the set, I hear you.
That's the general rule, but there's major exceptions. That is often the case. But, for example, one of the first things you would say about The Great Comet is you would talk about its immersive environmental scenic design and those incredible costumes, which I actually think should win the Tony because they're both ancient, 1800s Russian costumes and contemporary punk rock at the same time, and that they really navigate on that edgy thing there really well, and the lighting is crucial in that. So among the most important elements of some shows are the design. You wouldn't start off with design when talking about Come From Away, although it's a very efficient, versatile ensemble piece. But the most striking thing about The Great Comet is how it's staged. It's a landmark in terms of its staging for Broadway. I've seen other things like that out here, but it's much harder to get that onto Broadway.
Now, we're finishing up our conversation with the obviously very smart, very accomplished, and very fun to talk to, Michael Grossberg, all about the theater. Remember that you can read his reviews of the Broadway shows that he's seeing, and also, of course, all the stuff he's seeing in Columbus at the Columbus Dispatch. What's their URL? Do you know?
It's dispatch.com.
Just dispatch.com. Can I ask you, Michael, what is your favorite play of all time? We talk so much about musicals. Do you have a favorite play?
Well, just in the past 10 years, I was just thinking of this while I was on Broadway. Just in the past 10 or 15 years, some of my favorite plays include Doubt, Wit, and The Pillowman.
All three one-word titles. Okay, cool. Any particular reason why those resonated with you more than the bunches of other plays that you've seen?
I just think they were masterworks. Wit and Doubt have this great economy of precision and theatricality. The Pillowman is rather Baroque and Rococo in its multiple levels, but I sometimes love that. And I was a huge fan of Martin McDonagh before that, but I thought, well, that's really something above and beyond his Lenaine trilogy. And I love the themes of it, and I just thought it was fascinating.
Let me ask you also, we haven't really talked about revivals, and you mentioned a couple of times that Sunset Boulevard is one of your more favorite musicals. Did you get to go back and see Glenn Close this time?
If I was just going on my own, I would go and pay for a ticket to see it, because when I first saw Sunset Boulevard, I thought, wow, this is such a cumbersome staging, but there's some wonderful stuff here. I actually had mixed feelings about this grand kabuki approach that Glenn Close was taking originally. I hear that she's made it more intimate and more sympathetic, which I think there was definitely room for that. But I thought Sunset Boulevard is probably one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's first-rank enduring musicals if they could only get rid of this cumbersome staging and that huge $10 million staircase. And then when I heard they were doing something like that in London, I thought, I'm dying to see that. So then when it finally came here in that version, I couldn't see it because I just couldn't justify going to a limited run revival just because, it's ending in mid-June. And I really have to think about my readers. They need to have an opportunity to see this show that I'm reviewing, ideally that's going to run for a while and tour. And unfortunately, that one isn't. But I'm just so glad that it's successful, that it's had a second chance, because I think there really was that potential.
Now, did you get a chance to catch, and I hope you did, because this is a show that I did see, the revival of Hello, Dolly, with Bette Midler and David Hyde Pierce?
I do like Jerry Herman, but the one show of his that I reviewed during my career was La Cage aux Folles, and that's my favorite. For some reason, growing up, I never loved Hello, Dolly. I never loved May. Now, there's 3 or 4 really good songs in each of them, but my favorite Jerry Herman song is from Mac and Mabel, Time Heals Everything. That is an incredible song, and I know they've been trying to fix the book, and they occasionally try to do Mac and Mabel. I'm waiting for somebody to fix the book of Mac and Mabel and revive that and get that musical to work again, because I think Time Heals Everything is it's such a great song, and then in its last 3 words, it suddenly becomes a musical theater song that connects to that particular show. It's just a brilliant song.
And I'm just having a weird moment here, because yesterday, out of the blue, for no reason at all, I was thinking about Mac and Mabel. And was thinking, that's a Herman show that they should bring back. I saw a version in London that worked pretty well about 20 years ago. And I was thinking, what do you say to this? For the stars, as Max Sennett, Nathan Lane, and Laura Benanti as Mabel Normand. Yes?
Well, I think Nathan Lane's perfect. I'm not sure. I think there's several people who could play Mabel. I'm not sure, but I think that's exciting. But the last Chicago conference of the American Theater Critics Association, I went to that, and I think you went to that. Jerry Herman dropped by for the afternoon, and we had a chance to meet him, and he was talking, and I don't know if he was saying in that particular afternoon, it was such a thrill to meet him, but I remember in some interview he gave, he was talking about how proud he was of Time Heals Everything, because it's a classic song that can be sung outside of the context of the show. But the last 3 words, Mabel singing Time Heals Everything, and she keeps doing variations on that, April, August, autumn, winter. But the last 3 words, except loving you. And that makes it a integrated book musical song that reflects her character, and he was just so thrilled that he could like come up with this little pivot that's so concise that completely made it work as a musical theater song as well as a great song. And I thought, that's a really nifty achievement.
Well, it has been a nifty achievement for us to have you, Michael Grossberg, in the Daverhood, talking about theater. I hope we can do this maybe next year if you're back in town seeing a bunch more shows, because this is so much fun for me, and I'm sure for the listeners too. Remember, folks, to read his reviews in Dispatch.com, and wishing you much more theater, much more success, and hey, you got through this interview without passing the stone. So congratulations on that as well.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Talk to you soon. Have a great one, man.